15 trillion in debt and one in the vote. Fractional reserve banking is about to make the markets turn cold. The market's dropping, creamers yelling, but it's just too late. Bitcoin and blockchain have to regulate.
Hi everybody, Renegade Investor here, and today we are talking about why Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency during this new decade. Before we start though, it's important to acknowledge that Bitcoin is much more than just currency and money. It is a revolutionary network and platform that is facilitating an entirely new global financial system, but its abilities to facilitate a peer-to-peer currency and sound money is without a doubt two of its key value components. To some, this may seem like a crazy statement, given the relatively short period that Bitcoin has been around and the size of its current market cap at just over $100 billion. But the more time you spend looking at Bitcoin, the more you realize that its attributes make it such a superior platform for building a global financial system. In fact, it sometimes feels like Bitcoin has been sent from the future to destroy the legacy financial system for not being fit for purpose. Having studied Bitcoin every day for several years, it's actually harder to see how Bitcoin will not become a global reserve currency than how it will. And whilst this might seem like a bold statement at this time, this video is going to look at all the reasons why Bitcoin will make a far superior global reserve currency than the current US dollar and even gold. So what is a global reserve currency? A global reserve currency is described by many sources as a currency that is held in large quantities by governments and institutions as a means of international transaction, international investment, and as a means to support the value of national currencies. The current main global reserve currency is the US dollar issued by the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank in unlimited amounts, with the Fed balance sheet recently hitting all-time highs. And this is important as global reserve currencies are also often considered a hard or sound currency or a safe haven currency that cannot be printed in unlimited amounts. In fact, since 1971, there has been a complete detachment of reserve currencies from an underlying store of value, which historically was gold. When President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and ended the conversion of fiat currencies into gold all around the world, he essentially put the whole world onto a fiat standard prone to endless devaluation. Half a century later, he has inadvertently set up an unprecedented and perfect global macro environment for Bitcoin to dominate and become a global reserve currency. With a world drowning in 250 trillion in debt and fiat currencies in a race to the bottom as governments try to buoy up markets and support their exports through devaluation, Bitcoin has been circling like an apex shark, biding its time to make a killer blow to the archaic legacy financial system. Whilst you could argue that gold has always been the underpinning of the global financial system when looking at Exeter's inverted pyramid, even gold is not safe from Bitcoin's growing influence in an increasing borderless and digital world, and we'll talk more on this later. So let's take a look at this in more detail. If I was to describe a perfect global reserve currency, I think it would be apolitical, geopolitically neutral, a level playing field platform not controlled by any single individual government, banking or corporate entity that can facilitate international transactions, international investment, and is a sound or hard money that can't be arbitrarily devalued and thus can support the value of national currencies. Right now, there are so many reasons why Bitcoin has unbeatable attributes that fit this definition perfectly and goes above and beyond anything we have ever seen before. So let's take a look at Bitcoin's attributes that make it so perfectly suited to be a global reserve currency. First off, Bitcoin is unconfiscatable. If you have your private keys, you have your Bitcoin, and no third party can take those from you. And you can use Bitcoin as an international payment to transact with whoever you want, and no one can stop you. Compare this to the current international payment system SWIFT, which is being used more and more as a political weapon by the United States to influence political outcomes all over the world, and has more than 30 active financial and trade sanctions as well as extensive surveillance. And it becomes clear that Bitcoin is positioned perfectly to compete with the US dollar for global reserve currency status in this area. Not to mention the insidious confiscation of purchasing power and wealth through the constant debasement of the US dollar by the Federal Reserve and through fractional reserve banking, which again, Bitcoin as a sound money would prevent as a global reserve currency. Next up, Bitcoin is immutable unlike other global reserve currencies. At its core, Bitcoin is a decentralized global digital asset registration system that facilitates real-time accounting, auditing, and settlement without having to trust a third party that could arbitrarily change or manipulate records. With Bitcoin, the blockchain ensures the ledger history is set in stone forever, which is perfect for international settlement, as it creates immutable records of transactions that cannot be changed by any individual entity. In addition to this, changes to the Bitcoin protocol such as monetary policy, the amount of coins issued, or block size changes are also immutable without complete consensus from developers to miners and end users as well. In fact, Bitcoin is absolutely perfect for global trade, as its inelastic supply curve that is so predictable will allow all global countries that use it to make solid investment decisions and road plans without the insecurity that comes from arbitrary changes. And this is in stark contrast to the US dollar, which is used in about 2/3 of global trade, whose monetary policy is subject to change almost on a monthly, if not weekly basis, either through rate changes, supply changes, or forward guidance on the whim of a handful of individuals that have the potential to be corrupted. Another key aspect of Bitcoin that makes it perfect as a global reserve currency is that payments are uncensorable between whichever countries want to transact. So this is a great way to eliminate the weaponization of the current payment rails like we see with SWIFT that is used to push for political outcomes and global hegemony by influence and manipulating countries by proxy. The next reason is fast, irreversible payments. Bitcoin has the ability to be transferred globally within minutes and soon within seconds with layer 2 scaling techniques like the Lightning Network. In fact, Bitcoin could save hundreds of millions of years in transaction settlement time annually all around the world, as well as saving users huge amounts in transaction costs, as the payment is also the settlement, unlike the SWIFT system. In fact, SWIFT has been widely criticized for inefficiency. The Financial Times stated in 2018 that transfers frequently pass through multiple banks before reaching their final destination, making them time-consuming, costly, and lacking transparency on how much money will arrive at the other end. On top of this, the costs are not only applied at both ends of the transaction process, but also in the currency conversion rates that Bitcoin would also eliminate. In addition, SWIFT does not facilitate the transaction or settlement, it rather sends payment orders to initiate that additional process, making it much less efficient than Bitcoin. And finally, that brings us on to the last Bitcoin attribute, and that is uncounterfeitable. It is impossible to counterfeit or double spend a Bitcoin or arbitrarily change the distribution schedule of how many are created. Unlike the main global reserve currency, the US dollar, and other major fiat currencies that can not only be replicated pretty well by criminal organizations, but are legally counterfeited in the trillions by the Federal Reserve and other central banks, which destroys the purchasing power of the currency. In addition to this, it also makes Bitcoin a superior global reserve currency to gold in this area, which was last used to fully back the global reserve currency at the beginning of the 20th century, as gold bars have been seized with tungsten cores that then injects counterfeit gold into the market. And that brings us on to the second main reason why Bitcoin would make a superior global reserve currency, and that's because it's superior to gold in many different ways. Arguably, gold has always been the underpinning of the global monetary system, despite its official detachment from the backing of the US dollar in 1971, as it has always been viewed as Tier 1 collateral, especially by central banks who have been buying gold aggressively for the last decade, whilst they have simultaneously been devaluing paper currencies. But Bitcoin is superior to gold in many different ways, which I will show you now. This will anger a lot of precious metal advocates who believe the value of money must be stored within itself. But the truth is, when it comes to Bitcoin, the value of the currency is attributed to the value and utility of the underlying network and the value it can facilitate for humanity, which I believe is in the tens of trillions of dollars. Whilst I do have money invested in precious metals, and I believe that they are in a new bull market that has a long way to run, I am not blind to how absolutely revolutionary Bitcoin is. So let's take a look at how fiat, gold, and Bitcoin match up on all the key attributes of what makes money, and why Bitcoin is so suitable to become a global reserve currency. First off, Bitcoin matches the fungibility and non-consumable nature of both gold and fiat. Next up, Bitcoin is the most portable currency on the planet. In fact, ownership is simply changed by who owns the private keys to the public address the coins are sent to, and settlement happens within minutes. This is much faster than fiat, as settlement is included in the transaction, and much faster than gold, which becomes highly difficult to transact with when using higher denominated amounts, which requires transport under armed guard and can be highly costly and very inefficient in a digital world. Next up, Bitcoin is the most durable monetary unit in the world in that it is digital and immune to any physical degradation. It is the most highly divisible unit in the world as well, surpassing any other currency by being divisible down to 100 millionth of a unit, and is the most easily transactable currency, especially online where transactions can be made simply by scanning a barcode. In addition, Bitcoin is the most scarce monetary unit in the world and has no ties to government, which brings us on to one of Bitcoin's most valuable attributes over gold, in that it is completely decentralized and trustless. Bitcoin is also programmable, opening up a multitude of different use cases that is simply not possible with gold or fiat currency. And this brings us on to the third main reason why Bitcoin will make a superior global reserve currency, and that is we are heading further into the digital age and the encryption age, where encryption and privacy services will trade at a premium due to the erosion of privacy during the digital age. When gold was last fully acting as a global reserve currency, when it fully backed fiat currency, the tragic events of World War I were taking place, and the Titanic had recently sank, and the internet was still 80 years away from gaining mainstream adoption. In the 21st century, the world is a completely different place. The entire world lives online. It has become digitally borderless. People have instant gratification, they expect everything to be fast and instant, and the world is more comfortable than ever with digital currencies, albeit completely flawed fiat currency that has turned us into debt slaves. In my opinion, the idea of reverting to gold or any other precious metal as a commonly used medium of exchange and transaction for an online world has never looked more archaic and unlikely, and the idea of gold or precious metal backed cryptocurrency is absolutely dead on arrival, as it would take away the main value proposition of a cryptocurrency in that it is decentralized, has no intermediaries, and no centralized counterparty risk. Bitcoin fits every need for a global reserve currency for an online digital world in the 21st century, and its attributes make it far superior to gold and fiat currency for this purpose, as we move further into the encryption age and the growth of old technology. The fourth main reason why Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency is the macroeconomic environment that Bitcoin has been born into, which has created the perfect incubator for Bitcoin to grow and dominate. The truth is, there has never been a better time in history for a grassroots, free market currency like Bitcoin to establish itself and succeed in becoming a competing currency and monetary policy. The main macro reason is the collapse of fiat government currencies all over the world. For the first time in history, every major fiat currency is simultaneously being debased into oblivion after Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and global debt went exponential. Just like the Soviet Union's Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster that was a catalyst for the demise of the centralized Politburo of the Soviet Union, I believe central banks and fiat currency are currently having their Chernobyl moment that will massively ruin trust in central banking and government currency for the foreseeable future, and will catapult Bitcoin into a global reserve currency status as one of the few monetary units that is immune from this monetary meltdown. As governments and central banks race to the bottom to devalue their currencies to support exports, markets, and run deficits, all these currencies will continue to crash against Bitcoin. As I touched on earlier, the weaponization of SWIFT and other payment rails is another important reason why the macro environment is perfectly poised to help Bitcoin become a global strategic asset and world currency. Whether it's the aggressive use of sanctions against multiple countries through SWIFT, preventing gold holdings from repatriation, or cutting off countries from funds held at accounts at the Federal Reserve, like Iraq, which threatened to collapse their economy after they voted against the occupation of their country by foreign forces. Countries all over the world are not blind to the political weaponization of these transaction methods, and Bitcoin is the only open source neutral level playing field that could be used as a global standard with the guarantee that it cannot be politically gamed by any single group of countries. And this leads into the next macro reason why Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency, and that is the fact that the world is developing into a multipolar world, as observed by Michael Krieger in his article, The Old World is Dying. As trust breaks down further between countries and tensions rise as the legacy monetary system collapses, economic warfare will become more and more prevalent between blocs, and the world will be in desperate need of a neutral payments rail like Bitcoin. And this can really be seen through the growing trend of de-dollarization, as countries move away from the main global reserve currency in all aspects of global trade and investment, as well as the massive increase in gold buying and gold repatriation to diversify reserves. In addition to this, we have seen countries like China and Russia working on SWIFT alternatives as a way to mitigate politicization of the SWIFT system and the US dollar. And when you add all of this together, it points to the fact that the world is in desperate need and without a doubt heading in a direction of a global standard monetary unit and payments platform that only Bitcoin can facilitate. So the question a lot of people will be asking at this point is, if other countries are developing these new SWIFT systems, and almost every central bank is talking about creating a blockchain-based state currency, or even a global central bank blockchain-based currency, as Mark Carney recently proposed, why won't they just become the new global reserve currency as opposed to Bitcoin? And this leads us on to the fifth main reason why Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency, and that is that states and central banks cannot compete with Bitcoin on multiple different levels. The first main reason is Bitcoin is trustless. It is the only monetary unit and payments network in the world that can be completely trusted to do exactly as the protocol was programmed to do. And at its core, Bitcoin is simply math, which is 100% reliable. Secondly, open innovation. Governments and central banks won't be able to keep up with the open innovation and growing utility and services being built on the Bitcoin blockchain. For the same reason, private intranets were never able to compete with the internet. Thirdly, confidence. After the current financial crisis of 2020, confidence in central bank and the government's ability to run financial systems will be shattered, leaving no winners. Although there will be resistance, all it will take is one government or central bank to adopt Bitcoin in their reserves, and game theory will ensure that other countries follow suit in quick succession. And it is highly possible that this is already happening in the background. The fourth reason why Bitcoin has a big advantage over central banks and government is because of its monetary policy. Bitcoin is emerging as a rock of stability due to its inelastic, predictable supply curve, where issuance and inflation rates can be predicted decades into the future. Its fixed monetary policy and sound money attributes is simply much more suited to act as a global reserve currency, and there is little chance that state actors will willingly give up their power of the printing press, which is like a drug addiction to them, to implement a hard money alternative. And finally, first mover advantage. Whilst most central banks and governments are still talking about their intentions and plans to create state-backed blockchain currencies to compete with Bitcoin, which has highlighted just how out of date and unfit for purpose fiat currency and legacy payment rails are. In reality, they are so far behind Bitcoin, it's hard to see how inept bureaucrats with little real-world experience or skills are going to organize any viable competition to Bitcoin that has been around for over 11 years, has faced every attack possible, and has such huge momentum behind it because of its 7 interlaced network effects. And that brings us nicely onto the 6th reason why Bitcoin is destined to become the main global reserve currency, and that is Bitcoin's mining network effect. Bitcoin's mining hash rate is one of the most important metrics in the entire Bitcoin ecosystem, and it can also be a good indication as to why Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency. The reason for that is throughout history, the world has always tended towards one dominant currency as the global reserve currency due to the network effects of that dominant currency. An observation made by Avinash Persad at the Daily Reckoning, where he states, "There are good reasons why there is seldom more than one dominant currency. Reserve currencies have the attributes of a natural monopoly, or in modern parlance, a network. If it costs extra to trade with someone who uses a different currency than you, it makes sense for you to use a currency that most other people use. This makes that currency yet bigger and cheaper to use. There is a good analogy with a computer operating system. In that world, Windows is the dollar." And it's easy to see how this applies to Bitcoin, especially with its powerful 7 interlaced network effects. But the mining network effect is so important due to the fact that crypto mining is a zero-sum game, and a network with the greatest hash power is not only the most secure, but also the most desirable to invest in, which works like a positive feedback loop which influences all the other network effects. In this sense, as mentioned in the article, Bitcoin's unprecedented dominance in the mining hash rate wars will likely lead to it being the dominant cryptocurrency and most likely to become a global reserve currency. It will be recognized as the dominant blockchain that is the only one safe enough to hold trillions of dollars in value, and thus the one used by the vast majority of people. The last reason I believe Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency is the fact that it is going to become preferred collateral the world over for so many reasons, a lot of which are well highlighted by this Twitter thread from Aaron at Fiat Minimalist. He states, with the exception of volatility, Bitcoin scores, or will soon score, better than all other assets in all what makes a good collateral. Dimensions such as liquidity, marketability, 24/7 availability, speed and ease of settlement, global acceptance, fungibility, etc. In fact, as Bitcoin grows in liquidity and market cap and volatility lowers, it will be hard to see how Bitcoin will not become preferred collateral for international investment, transactions, trade, and bond loan issuance. The reason for this is manifold, as mentioned by Aaron. The speed of settlement is far greater than the legacy financial system and can happen 24/7 and is irreversible. In addition, Bitcoin cannot be rehypothecated or recollateralized on-chain due to its unspent transaction outputs or UTXOs. Unlike precious metals, which are alleged in many cases to have multiple claims on every contract due to rehypothecation, which the 2020 financial crisis is starting to really highlight as gold and silver supply dries up. Instead, Bitcoin is a bearer asset where ownership is mathematically verified. Next, Bitcoin is borderless, eliminating a lot of the currency conversion and middleman fees, although escrow fees could still occur. So it's possible to envisage, even in this early stage, how Bitcoin can become preferred collateral, especially in a world where all other currencies are collapsing in value. In fact, it'd be easy to envisage a scenario in a not too distant future where countries and corporations offer a discount for oil, resources, agricultural products, medical supplies, and other trade products if they are paid for in Bitcoin, which will again increase the incentive to buy, hold, and use Bitcoin and make the overall network and ecosystem more liquid. So those are some of my thoughts on why I personally believe Bitcoin is destined to become a global reserve currency. If Bitcoin maintains its first mover advantage, which I believe it will, and avoids any severe technical issues, based on Bitcoin's previous growth cycles and future growth expectations for revolutionary technology, based on the S-curve adoption model, I believe that in the next 5 to 10 years, it would not be unrealistic for Bitcoin to officially or unofficially be recognized as a global reserve currency. So thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.
If you know the markets like I know, then you don't want to partake in this. It's the Ben Bernanke era, and he's messing around with Operation Twist. If you smoke like yelling smokes and you're high on opium every day, all I can say is get your ass into gold, silver, Bitcoin, and expect you eat to infinity.